Welcome to the Wharton Global Youth Meetup Live Alumni Career Chat. I'm Diana Drake, Managing Editor with the Wharton Global Youth Program. As part of our ongoing series of conversations with Wharton grads this summer, we're talking today with Wharton MBA LD Salmanson, who is founder of Cherre, a leader in real estate data and insight. Prior to founding Cherre, LD served as Executive Director of Oppenheimer's Private Shares Group after Oppenheimer acquired Greencrest Capital. LD co-founded Greencrest to enable pre-initial public offering transactions in some of the largest private tech companies in the world, including Facebook, Twitter, and Uber. Prior to that, LD served as the principal of Knight Capital Group's private equity fund and previously as a captain of the Israeli army. He earned his MBA in finance from Wharton and is a Joseph Wharton Merit Scholar. He also holds degrees in finance and international law from IDC Herzliya in Israel. LD, thank you for joining our GYM Career Chat. It's a pleasure to meet you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So before we get started, I want to encourage all of our viewers to drop your questions in the chat as you think of them. We will have time for Q&A after we get to know our guests a little bit better. All right, so your LinkedIn profile, let's go there first. It notes that you talk about commercial real estate, data analytics, and machine learning. The intersection of all those things is where I'd like to start. Can you tell me more about Cherre, the company you founded, and what exactly it means to be a leader in real estate data and insight? What is real estate analytics?
Oh, sure thing. So Cherre is a data management platform for real estate. So our clients are the very largest asset managers in the world. So think folks like Brookfield and Starwood and Capital One or Nuveen, EQT, some of the biggest asset managers in the world with trillions of dollars under management. And the challenge they have is not a lack of data, it's actually an abundance of data that doesn't really communicate with each other. And if only we could wave this magic wand, have those data systems and data vendors speak with each other, our clients can make better investment underwriting decisions. That's essentially what we do. We provide them a platform to be able to connect all those data sets and make them instantly available for both the technical side of the house, to where the engineers and folks like that, but also the business side of the house to get instant insight. And I think the best analogy here is what happened in financial services over the last kind of 20, 30 years. We went from people trading notes on the exchange floor to the point where today the New York Stock Exchange sits in Jersey in a unassuming place called Secaucus, right? So that's where the actual New York Stock Exchange sits, and it sits in a warehouse with servers. It's not very exciting when you actually think about it. New York Stock Exchange is a media room. That's where people go to take pictures. That's where the CNBC News Channel will show stock information all day long. That's not where the exchange is. We've moved from a world of generalists to a world where very specific skill sets are required to be good at that. The same thing's happening in real estate, and we provide a small part of that world, which is the infrastructure for that world, but it's the most important part to get things started. So that's what we do. We've been doing this for about 6 years. Raised about $75 million so far from some of the biggest investors in the world and from the heads of those largest banks, as well as folks like Intel Capital and Crow Holding and folks like that. So really, really great investors. We've been kind of 2-3x doubling, tripling every year, both on revenue and headcount, and it's been a really exciting ride so far.
So maybe you could unpack it just a little bit for us novices. And really take a big step back for a minute and help us understand exactly what the commercial real estate world looks like. I mean, what is commercial real estate?
Yeah, sure thing. So real estate's the largest asset class in the world, but real estate means a lot of things, right? So real estate would include, first of all, residential real estate. So where we live, that could be single family homes, that could be multifamily, which is code name for like buildings, right? It could be condos, it could be rentals, or co-ops in places like New York. It could also mean some other types of asset classes like manufactured housing, mobile homes, assisted living facilities. All that would typically fall mostly on the residential side, but some of that is very much commercial. Commercial is usually things that are managed, right? So I am a fund. I get money from pension funds, endowment funds, or private people or citizens raising through the public market. And now I take that money and I invest it in real estate on that behalf. That's typically what we would call commercial real estate. And that would often include things like office buildings, industrial warehouse, retail spaces, stores, malls, things like that. It would also typically include things like what we'd call multifamily, which is rental buildings, meaning I'll own the entire property and typically I'll rent out units within that to private people. That would also include some other things like infrastructure, industrial, so roads and airports and land and things like that would also typically fall into that category. But there are also some secondary and tertiary kind of assets that would fall into that world. So this world of derivative products, typically called things like CMBS, RMBS, you may have heard of them. That means commercial mortgage-backed securities, residential mortgage-backed securities. What that really is are instruments that were invented by a gentleman named Cherre back in the day, which means I want to be able to get exposure to certain assets without actually owning the asset. Meaning I want to be able to take the mortgage, for example, that I get on somebody's home and pool all those mortgages together, meaning connect them together and sell certain parts of that risk to different people. And each one of those can be sold separately to sophisticated investors. And that also kind of falls within our purview of how do we take secondary and tertiary type value from assets that are real and turn them into financial instruments that are not necessarily real. So all that would typically fall under the purview of Cherre.
That was a loaded question. Commercial real estate is much deeper than I thought it was. So in the past few years, many of us have left our collective office spaces to work from home. And I'm wondering how the pandemic has impacted the commercial real estate industry and what that's meant specifically for Cherre. What was the opportunity amid the challenges?
It's an incredible experiment. So it's an economist's dream, right? So all these things that we had in our mind in the back of our heads of, hey, what would happen if, and now we have a natural experiment to make that real. And we also have different policies in different locations. So we get to have a lot of natural experiments going on at the same time. So the economist in me is giddy. That being said, it's still a story being told, right? I think it's a little too early to tell the story. I can share maybe some of the anecdotal information that we see so far, obviously backed by some data, but retail has been an asset class that's kind of sucked for a really long time. And the reason it sucked is two things. One is in the US, we have more retail than anywhere else in the world by orders of magnitude, right? So for every square foot that exists in Europe, we have of retail, we have 10 in the US. And our closest runner up there is Canada, and really Canada is kind of an extension of the US in many ways from the market standpoint. I know they hate when I say that, but again, 90% of all Canadians live within 100 miles of the US border. So essentially they're American, whether they like to admit it or not. And that's what retail looks like. So we've overbuilt to death. And then we overbuilt also in these massive spaces like indoor malls. I don't know, I'm old, I'm 40, right? But then most of the people on the call here, I imagine you don't go to the mall that often. When I was a kid, we used to hang out at the mall. Like that was a thing to do. We would just literally go to the mall. We had nothing else to do. We didn't have cell phones. There was only so much video you can watch. TV was basically live and nothing was interesting during the day. And, we'd just go to the mall and hang out there. And I'd spend the whole day there after school. And for not best use of our time, candidly, but that was what people did. Nobody goes to the mall anymore. Mall is more like an experience thing, or I go to the movie theater that happens to be in the mall, or, maybe when we were kids, we had to go buy something at the Gap, right? But it's changed dramatically. Our consumption patterns have changed dramatically over time. And the biggest shift has been the move to online retail, right? So there's a graph that shows how we've been growing in our consumption online, and there's a mirror graph of how we're consuming less in brick and mortar stores. And that's kind of been the story over the last few decades. And what we see now is actually a rapid acceleration of that trend during COVID, because everybody learned how to buy online, right? So my mother's turning 80, never bought anything online during COVID, had to buy stuff online. She's not going back. She's never going back to buy the things that she learned to buy online, offline. And once you learn that behavior, it's pretty much there for good. You might still go and get your fruits and vegetables, because you want to touch them, but generally you move online. So what we see is that graph, and we see immediate vertical jump, and then we see that trend continue, but maybe at a slightly more acute vector. And that's the story of retail. So brick and mortar is becoming more of either last minute type things. I need the product right this second, like a drugstore or something like that, or it's becoming more of an experience, right? So pop-up shops, experiential type stores, things like that. But we're way overbuilt, and even the models have changed. Instead of renting a place, opening up a restaurant, today there's a rev share. So I'll share the revenue that we create with the landlord. That's how we typically do retail. Residential has also changed, right? So the good news about residential is we have to live somewhere, right? So if I leave the city, then I live somewhere else. I have to live somewhere. And what we see here is two trends. One, which started in 2008-9, which is what's called SFR, the single family rental. So people renting single family homes really wasn't a thing when we grew up. I either owned a home or you rented in the city. Nobody rented a house out in the suburbs. That was a really uncommon thing. And it's a combination of having low interest rates that allowed us to buy things back then and more purchasing power in dollars. So we were all more affluent back then compared to the cost of homes. But it's more than that. It's because in 2008, something happened, which is the global recession, which made buying a home really impossible for a huge quantity of Americans overnight, which is a really sad human story. And what happened is really big private equity funds swooped in to buy all these homes that were in distress and started renting them out to the same people who no longer could afford those homes. And that asset class has exploded over the years. It used to be, I think it was about 500,000 in 2008. Today it's 18 million homes, and it's going to be another 14 million by the end of this decade. So massive asset class. There's only about 110 million single family homes in the US, right? So by the end of this decade, 30 out of 110 are going to be rental properties. So going from privately owned to commercially owned and rented back. So a massive, massive shift in the way we think about those trends. And it's happening in the suburbs right now. And the reason it's happening in the suburbs is because we're no longer tethered to the office, right? So some 50-ish% of jobs, in theory, could require you to, no longer will require you to have to be physically in the same location that you work, right? So certain jobs require you to be that, if you're an air traffic controller, there are a lot of jobs that require you to physically be in the office, right? If you're building construction, if you're anything like that would obviously require physical location, but many other jobs won't. And that shift is encouraging people to either move to places where taxes are lower or they have more square foot per person. So they have more, garden or some type of environment like that. And they're moving into places that right now don't necessarily have the supply to meet them. So prices are going up dramatically in all these suburbs, and people are building, but they can't build fast enough because it's really, really slow. And what does that mean for office as an asset class? That's a massive question. Not to answer yet, but I can tell you that office spaces in major cities are under 20% utilized. Prices are going down. Nobody's renewing it at the same rate. So that's changing. So we have to think about what we do with those spaces. And then we may have to build new spaces in suburbs, right? These kind of like hub and spoke models where I'll have a small satellite office in Austin where I have 6 employees, and I might share that space with 10 other people and maybe add like a WeWork type remote. Kind of funny how Adam Newman's dream is coming back in 2022. I can share a funny experience that Adam pitched that company to me in 2011-12 together with Ellie Feingold, who's one of my investors today at Crow. And we both heard that story and said, this guy's insane. There's no way that world will ever come into play. And here he is, kind of vindicated, putting aside all the weird practices that happen in that company. But that world is real. That world he pitched, which is you're no longer going to have to go into the office with everyone, and you're going to have an experience type facility shared with other people in other places, the creator market that's really becoming real. So there's some of the things that we see generally in the market. The last thing I would say is warehousing is becoming a huge asset, because as retail is moving from brick and mortar to online shopping, that means I have to get the goods to your house, right? So they have to be stored in warehouses, last mile delivery, things like that. I mean, there's so many companies that do last mile 50-minute delivery. It's insane.
Amazing. Lots of changes happening. So I want to remind everyone and those who joined us late, please put your questions in the chat, and we will be having a Q&A in a couple minutes here. So you first met your colleague, Ben Hezok, in the 4th grade, and you guys were business partners by the time you were in junior high. You are still in business together today. Ben is co-founder of Cherre. This longstanding partnership is unique and has been very fruitful. Can you talk about your early years together? What was your first business, and how have you collaborated successfully for so many years?
So when Ben and I first met, we were mortal enemies, just to be clear, right? So
that's how it always starts.
Yeah, so I was originally from Providence. I grew up in New York City, and then when I was about 13, 14, I moved to Israel. But I came there in the middle of the 4th grade for a really short period of time, and Ben was in the other class, right? And since there were 2 4th grade classes, of course, not mine, he became a mortal enemy. That was enough at the 4th grade for us not to hit it off. And then when I came to Israel, kind of the end of the 7th grade, we were in the same class. And I remember, I something around Star Trek. I can't remember exactly what it was. Somebody said, oh, something Star Trek. I said, oh, you like Star Trek? I like Star Trek. And that was it. In Israel, there were basically 3 channels when we were 13, 14. There was channel 1, channel 2, and Middle East TV. And Middle East TV had Star Trek on at 2 o'clock every Wednesday. And we used to rush home together on Wednesdays to watch Star Trek, and became really good friends. I'm a little nerdy, if it wasn't clear.
Oh, wait, I got to ask you, which Star Trek?
It was the Next Generation.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
The card. But yeah, and then, by the way, the original Star Trek was only 1 season. I know it's a funny story, but they kept running on rerun forever. It's basically just 1 short season, but got a lot more noise. And then we really started our first company by accident. We never really thought about it. We were both writing code at the time. So when you would buy an IBM computer at the time, it came with a manual. And the first half of the manual explained how to operate the computer and clean it and keep maintenance. The second half was visual basic, or basic, sorry, not visual basic, just taught basic, the programming language. We both kind of learned how to write in basic, and then we started writing a little in C, and eventually we moved into some other languages, Pascal. But at that time, we were just kind of having fun, and we were building our own computers and kind of messing around. And one day we had to go home and fix a computer for one of the family friends, and I don't remember which family it was and why and what we fixed. So we can't remember. Again, it's a long time ago. It's probably we're 40s. But we went home, or we tried to leave after that, and we thought we were doing kind of a favor for the family, and they offered us money. And we said, oh my God, we can make money for this? Like, this is like a hobby that we get paid for this shit. And, sure enough, a couple of days later, another family called us up and said, well, what do you charge? We said, charge, what do you want to pay? And they threw out a number, which in our world was ungodly, right? $140 an hour for the 2 of us to split. Or like, remember, this is like 30 years ago, 25 years ago. And, we're going to make $70 an hour each for doing something that we love. And then that really quickly became an IT services company, which later very quickly became a development shop. So we started writing websites in the early days in the 90s when websites were still cool. And then we started developing or deploying larger scale server farms for major companies, and eventually sold that company in 99, right before we both went to the Army.
Wow. So why the longevity? I mean, how have you managed to stay together for so long? Just deep roots?
My mother used to joke that Ben's my wife and then my wife's my best friend. It's probably a pretty accurate description. I think we really complete each other, and most relationships are not like that. So part of the reason we can do very well is our skill sets don't really overlap. I spend most of my time on sales strategy, business development. Ben spends most of his time on architecture, processes, things of that nature. And he's really good at that. I'm not so great at that. And I'm really good at what I do. He's not so great at that. So we have kind of our swim lanes. That's one. But I think the most important thing is we make each other better, right? So I can walk out of a pitch and be really excited about how good I did in one. And Ben will say, I don't know why you're smiling. You sucked. Like, we won, yeah, but you were horrible and we got lucky. And you better step your game up. You sucked. And I can at the same time walk out of a meeting that I lost the pitch and be really depressed. And so we did everything right. This was unwinnable. You did everything right. Let's move on. The old Homer Simpson adage, you can't blame yourself forever. Blame yourself once and move on. We've really learned how to complete each other over time and make each other better. We are really good friends. Our families are really good friends since we were kids. And it's been a really amazing relationship.
Very cool.
I wouldn't build a company with anyone else ever.
Oh, all right. Good to know. So back to LinkedIn for a minute. You define your job title as Maverick Herder. So I need you to explain that title. And also, what does a day in your work life look like?
It's a joke that really stuck with me over the years. So when LinkedIn first started, if your title said CEO, which by the way, I've never had the title CEO written anywhere. I think it's the most pretentious title, but you get a lot of recruiters and people trying to sell you services, and LinkedIn early days was basically spam central. So everybody would drive you crazy. So any title that you had, which was kind of official, would mean that people would basically spam you with shit all day long. And so I wanted just a title wasn't there. And it was more of a joke when someone said once, well, you manage these really smart people and you guide them. Like I hire mavericks, right? These people are the smartest people I've ever known, way smarter than I'll ever be. You don't get to manage them. You don't get to tell them what to do. At best, you can kind of herd them in the right direction and hope they do some smart things. So kind of became maverick herder as a joke a couple of companies ago, and that stuck. When I leave that company, I put up the real title, after we sell or something like that. But it's been maverick herder for quite a long time. It's really just a joke that kind of stuck.
All right, great. So it seems that relationships and partnerships are fundamental to success in your industry. Some may be going back as far as the fourth grade, but not every one of them. Can you tell us more about that and expand on what skills are most valuable for what you do?
Yeah, I think for founders, the most important skill always is storytelling. I think it's kind of strange to think about that, right? But it's really the most important skill that we have as humans, is being good storytellers. It's what engages people. It's what gets people excited to want to hear more. It's the reason people buy products. You don't sell products to companies, you sell emotions to people. And storytelling is the most important skill set. And when I look for senior people, I'm looking essentially for people who are storytellers, people who can take really complex ideas and really complex problems and put them into context and into stories that are engaging to humans. I mostly hire senior people in the last year. I don't hire a lot of junior people, but so most of my time is spent on helping I find the right people who will lead the companies, some kind of part in that company, and then helping them develop and grow over time. So those are some of the things I look for. Generally, we have a philosophy at Cherre. At the top of the mountain, we're all snow leopards, right? These little snow leopard dolls literally everywhere across the company, and all our marketing material has that. It's a Hunter Thompson quote, and it kind of says, hey, I'll never be able to hit it, throw a pitch like Ted Wilson and Ted Williams. I'll never be able to write Mr. Tambourine Man, but none of those yo-yos are able to write Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. At the top of the mountain, we're all snow leopards. Anybody who can do one thing in this world better than anyone else is a natural friend of mine. I think it's a reminder to all of us that, we're not Renaissance men. Those people died many years ago. We can't be everything for everyone. We can't be generalists. We have to find what it is that we do well. And I know that that's always aspirational. It's very hard to be the best in the world at anything, but if you try and be everything for everyone, you're essentially nothing for anyone. And I really encourage internally within Cherre to hire people who have a little ego, which will say, hey, I'm the best in the world at this, and then be able to deliver on that. And also it's one of those things that kind of manifests itself. You tell someone you're the best in the world, they believe they're the best in the world, they tend to become the best in the world at that and live up to that expectation. Critical thinking by far is the most important skill set that people can have. And stats in my mind is kind of number two that follows up on that. Analytics, essentially the combination of stats and critical thinking. It's very easy to look at a data point and think about, oh, wow, that looks accurate, but then ask where that data come from. How is it compiled? What biases exist in that data to make it look the way it is? What would be maybe the contra hypothesis? How would I try to refute that hypothesis? What data would I want to see to do that, right? That's essentially the skill set that I would look for most importantly in any role that we hire. And then depending on where they are in the company, if you're an engineer, that's pretty simple, hard skills around what languages you work in and how good you are in those languages, and maybe some other skill set in sales that's just storytelling. How easily can you digest the story and pitch it back to me? And again, different specific roles might have some specific skill sets.
Very interesting. And I mean, today, right, you ended up talking about data and data analytics and started with storytelling, but really it's what are the numbers? What story is the numbers telling, right? Are the numbers telling, and how can we weave that into?
I'd say that more lies have been told with Excel than in PowerPoint. So that is real. So being able to take numbers, contextualize them, understand where they're right, where they're wrong, and why, that's the hard part. Building the model to spit out the numbers, not to say it's easy, but it's easier. So you need both of those skills to succeed these days.
Great. So let's go back to your grad school days for a minute. Good old Wharton. What did you study here and how did that inform your path forward? I know you studied finance, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. Was there an experience or a moment when you gained clarity on your future career path?
I had no idea what I was going to do when I went to Wharton. I had sold a company before that, just before Wharton. I was kind of in retirement mode and mentally in my head, but I always really loved school. So was fortunate to apply to Wharton and get accepted. I ended up waiving the entire core curriculum except for one class. I basically took tests for each one of those different, curriculum, or had a previous core. I had I had 3 degrees before I went to Wharton. So undergrad in finance, law, and then a law school degree. So by the time I came to Wharton, a lot of those classes I had already done, except for one, which was Professor Eric Bradlow's course in marketing. And of course, I applied to waive for that class, and Eric wrote back something along the lines of, well, did you do the SABRE simulation? I had no idea what that was. And I said, I don't know what that is. Well, if you do the SABRE simulation, you can't waive out of the class. And then of course I found out that SABRE is only offered in Wharton, only offered in this class. And I was like, oh, that was kind of an asshole kind of move. You could just said no, right? And I walked into the very first class with Eric being like, it's this guy who couldn't just say no to me. And then the very first class with Eric starts with, he draws like this circle on the board which says marketing and says, tell me what you think about marketing. People throw out these things like branding, and I'm like, oh my God, all my worst nightmares about what this class is going to be. And I have this kind of preconception about Eric. Then Eric walks up and goes, if you think this is marketing, you're a moron. None of that's marketing. Marketing is statistics, marketing is data, and I'm going to teach you that. And I'm thinking, I really like this course.
That's great.
By far my favorite course in Wharton. Professor Bradlaw is one of the smartest professors at Wharton. Brilliant storyteller, by the way, back to the point of being able to combine statistics with storytelling. Probably challenged me more than any other course at Wharton from a thought standpoint. Maybe not as hard rigorously, but definitely from a thought standpoint. Ended up TAing quite a few of his classes afterwards, and I'm still close with him until this very day. It's kind of funny how that started, but I had no career path. I interviewed for banks during the kind of in the recruiting period, and was accepted to most of the large banks, then did consulting, or the other way around, and didn't want to go to any of them. None of them sounded really compelling. And then I accidentally at an event met someone who I pitched an idea to that I was thinking about for what later became Greencrest, and we sold to Oppenheimer. And then that summer I started building that company together, and essentially by the time we graduated, we already sold that company to Oppenheimer, and I joined Oppenheimer as executive director. So no plan to that career. Very random how that happened, but we had the idea. We knew we could execute really quickly. Ben was on board, so I was on board.
Yeah, and of course, the common thread all the way through is that you're very entrepreneurial, right? So it sounds like ideas have led the way, and passion for sure.
I don't know, ideas or maybe complaints. It's an old Golda Meir adage. She used to be the prime minister in Israel for a short period of time. And she used to say, Jews are really dissatisfied people. I'm not very religious in any way. Actually, I'm not religious at all. I'm not very Jewish at all. Actually, my mother is Christian. My father is Jewish. Neither practicing in any way. But I did get that kind of, dissatisfied kind of feeling about everything. I look at a situation, I think about why is that the case? I kind of complain that should be better, and I expect better when I know that there's an easy solution. And I try things to see about it. I mean, I told the story enough times. Go to Canada a lot because one of our big investors was out there, but he's still out there, just don't go as much these days. And when you come back from Canada, there's like these 2 lines in customs, and one's always packed and the other one's always empty for no reason, right? I have no idea why that's the case. But the very first time I went, I literally went over to the shoreline. I said, I guess I should be in that line. This one's not. No, this one's just the same line. And the question is, well, why is everyone over there and not trying this other line here? But that's been true every time I come back from Canada for years after that, right? It's the same line. Everybody always goes to the left for some weird reason. It's a little easier. Nobody goes to the line on the right, which is completely empty all the time. Or I can stand in line at a supermarket and figure out, like, why do we have 15 lines instead of one winding rhyme, like that? Like, these things frustrate me. And I think entrepreneurship is very much about finding a problem that you can get passionate about, and I'm passionate about every problem, really. It's just a question of, is it a market that's really big? Is my solution unique and defendable? Can we test that really quickly and see if validate our thesis around that? And if so, is that a kind of idea that gets venture capitalists excited to spend some money on?
Um, so have you had to pivot in a time of crisis, either personal or professional? And how did you adapt to the circumstances and persevere?
Not really, not in a professional sense. Our companies are always very thesis driven, except maybe the first one was basically by accident. But in that one, we pivoted every time there was a new client. Said, "I'll pay you a lot of money for X. I will do that now," right? But since then, we've been very, thesis driven, and we try and find. I mean, even Cherre, right? So I drew out this roadmap back on stack of paper. Literally drew out what the company would look like, 5 years down the road, and we're following that roadmap still today. And I have a really strong head of product that's kind of building on that vision and taking it in his own direction, but very much thesis driven. We don't really pivot in that sense. On a personal matter, I don't know that I ever had a plan for anything. I never knew what I wanted to do when I grow up. I still don't know what I want to do when I grow up. It's been very fortuitous in one way, but also just generally pretty random. I didn't plan on doing anything in life, although in retrospect, also everything sort of seems to make sense. And almost to other people around me, it seems as if this was the plan. I don't know. I see opportunities and I like to seize those opportunities. I'm not afraid to take risks. I think I also have the privilege of being able to take risks. I think that those things go together. But when I see something that's exciting to me and I see it as a potential opportunity, I'm not afraid of failure. No one ever remembers your failures, only your successes. You can fail a million times. No one will ever remember those failures. You succeed once, that's it, you're good. And I think that philosophy has always allowed me to fail many times very quickly and not care about that. So I've tried a lot of things. Pivot's probably not the right word. It's just I see an interesting idea, try it, see it doesn't work, move on to the next one really quickly and not be super passionate about those failures, and just be able to move on. And I think the biggest change in my life is actually happening recently. So I'm, again, recently turned 40 this year. And just now, my wife and I have been together for 22 years, had our first son. And it's been, thank you. It's been a really interesting change, right? So most of my friends have kids, going into college, right? And I'm, having a baby at the age of, post 40. It's been a really big change in my life, but it's been a really fun change. There is no way I could have done this in my 20s. I would have totally fucked it up. So I'm really happy that I waited a little more. I'm still a child mentally, but at least a little more mature. Also, I can afford a little more help, which is also definitely helpful and desirable, but it's probably the biggest change in my life in recent memory for sure.
Excellent. So let's have some fun for a minute. You are starting a new talk show. Who is your very first guest and why?
Starting to talk, I want ratings. So the most controversial, viral guest, someone horrible, somebody that just generates ridiculous amount of, someone like Elon Musk or like Trump. I don't know, somebody who generates like a shitload of viral content on their own just because they're going to be controversial as hell. Those are two people I have a lot of questions I'd want to ask to anyway. So, but yeah, or someone like Bernie Sanders, someone who's like ridiculously controversial. Because today we're in an extremely polarized environment, and the more polarized the content, the more controversial the content, the more virality it has. So I know it's a very cynical answer, but it's probably what I would think about. If I already have a viewership that's kind of guaranteed, and I want to start on something that's more interesting, probably more of what's called like the L6s, like somebody in the weeds, right? Somebody who's doing something that's probably not super visible, but's really, really interesting, 6 degrees down from the problem, that has a really interesting story to tell. Those are the kind of stories that get me really excited. But if I need to be controversial for ratings, we're definitely going that direction.
All right. So let's move on to some questions from our viewers. Sabrina asks, how has Cherre dealt with issues of gentrification in the world of real estate? Has data demonstrated greater needs for a removal or establishment of new laws in specific regions?
That's a really loaded question. So I will first share my own biases. So I'm a Rawlsian, religious Rawlsian follower. So I think about Rawlsian justice. So imagine the world behind a veil of ignorance. I don't know how I'm going to be born. male, female, non-binary, black, white, rich, poor. I have no idea. It could be anything that the world has. And I want to try and build the rules behind the veil. And while it's not a perfect solution, it helps me really understand the black and white, right? I would never allow a rule which says, oh, black people can be slaves. Clearly, I'm going to be black. I wouldn't allow that rule, right? Or I wouldn't allow a rule which says Jews can be murdered for being Jewish, because that seems like an unjust rule. But it doesn't solve all of them, right? It doesn't solve a very, let's say, controversial question right now, which is something maybe like abortion, right? So, because when does life begin is not a question that I can answer behind the veil in a way that satisfies all people. So it's not a catch-all solution for all types of challenges, nor should it be, but it gives me a good sense of how to think about things that are clearly immoral in that world. So that's one of my biases. I'm also part Jewish, sort of white, because Jews, I guess, are sort of white, and definitely can pass as white. So I've never had to deal personally with racial adversity. I've gotten to fights for being Jewish, but again, nothing that shaped my view of the world. And I've lived in a fairly affluent environment my entire life. I never had to wonder where my next meal comes from, right? So all these things are my kind of personal biases. I would call myself a classic liberal in the sense that I want people to be able to have the most amount of freedom that they can, respecting the fact that some freedoms overlap other people's freedoms. Very long disclaimer before I answer the question, because it really affects the way you look at the data. Right. Back to the point of being able to look at data and be able to answer questions. It's not enough to say that gentrification raises home prices. That is true. Gentrification is very highly correlated with prices of homes going up. Is that good or bad for society is not a necessarily easy question to answer. So those biases are really important. I generally think that diversity equals strength. So communities that have more than one of anything is typically a good thing. As you have more diversity in a population, you tend to spark more innovation, more wealth creation, more satisfaction of the people living there, and more resilience of that community. So think of New York City, one of the most diverse places in the world. Some issues around how diverse it is financially these days, but still one of the most diverse places in the world. Innovation comes out of that environment. So I think those are really, really good things that we want to encourage as society. I think gentrification also brings with it a lot of issues. People get priced out of their homes, and that's not a desired result. And I think that one of the solutions we've seen is price control. I think that's a very bad solution. Assuming we recognize that we want people to have homes that are stable, that allow them to continue to live in a respectful manner and have their children grow up in good environments. Assuming that's the case, some people might argue that it's not a desirable goal, but let's assume that it is. Then having people priced out of their homes is not the right answer, but also fixing prices is also not an answer, because that creates externalities that are really hard to control afterwards. There are a lot of other ways you might want to do that, creating tax abatements for developers to have more zoning rights, but maybe in exchange have rent controlled or at least regulated types of facilities. Maybe we have zoning rules that allow a lot more people to build, so we increase supply, which will essentially reduce costs to develop and reduce, obviously, pricing on the demand side of the house. So I encourage those types of tools more generally. Cities have all been gentrified at their core. Most suburbs are being gentrified as we speak. My mother lives in rural Atlanta. When my aunt first lived out there, a place called Cumming, the whitest place on earth, there was literally a KKK march that ran through there just before they moved in. Extremely waspy, racist environment. Today, the biggest community there is actually from Indian descent, India, the country, not Native American. And then 3 different minorities, including Black, Hispanic, and Jewish constituencies, and white communities, actually the smallest community in Cumming. And Cumming's exploded in value and home value and creative productivity over those years. So that there's a very strong reason to think that diversifying the population, which I don't call that gentrification, but diversification of the population is a good thing. Taking historically Black neighborhoods and turning them to white, not typically a great outcome for society, in my personal opinion. It usually pushes out the existing society and replaces it with a new society that just takes over that home and placing. We used to call that redlining or red zoning back in the day. That's usually not a desirable outcome, in my personal opinion.
I want to remind everyone, if you have any questions, we're going to be wrapping up in a few minutes, so please drop them in the chat now. All right, we have another question here. What's one business decision that you have made in the past that you would now change?
Oh, endless. There's so many of those that happen every day. So I make mistakes more often than most, literally every day. And when I think about, I assume I'm wrong about everything, right? So I'm an avid reader. Every time I read something, I learn something a little more about my personal opinion. I change my opinion ever so slightly. And the amount of things I read compared to how much things I could read is, insignificant. So I assume that had I read everything else out there, whatever opinion I have right now would be wrong by my own standard, right? Forget someone else's. So I approach all problems and all decisions assuming I'm wrong. So it allows me to be a little more liberated to make a mistake because I'm not afraid of being wrong. I know I'm wrong. It's just a question of why specifically and how bad. But I think about the mistakes I made that are most, I think about the most afterwards are things that are kind of interpersonal. Not sharing a thought or feeling that I had honestly with someone, hiding a feeling or hiding an emotion, trying to cover up for my own mistake because of ego, hubris, or fear. Those are the things that always end up, staying with you much, much later. The business decisions are not that important. Even the most consequential ones that end up to a company shutting down won't matter, a few years down the road. The personal stuff will always stick with you, and I've learned a lot from that over the years.
Where do you find inspiration in business? Your favorite books, your favorite podcasts? Do you listen to anything?
I do. I don't think I use any of those for inspiration, for ideas. I think being annoyed about a problem is usually my core inspiration. But I do listen to revisionist history, Malcolm Gladwell. I listen to Adam Grant. Michael Lewis, Against the Rules, is one of my favorite podcasts. Invisibilia is great. So those are some of the things I listen to pretty regularly. I mostly read history. It's pretty amazing how, if someone wants to say, the lesson of history is that we learn nothing from history. And that's probably the greatest thing. I mean, you can read novels about the Civil War, and you read the run up to the Civil War, and if you didn't know that it was a Civil War story, it sounds like today, right? So, which is unfortunate, things like, media creating sensationalism, politicians trying to, distort information to be able to get their agendas passed, whether they're religious or financial or whatever the case may be. So I like to read that just to remind me of context, and it also helps me not be very angry about certain things that I might see in the world and figure out why is things so bad or something like that. Those podcasts I mentioned are fun, they're easy to listen to. I think they're very inspirational. I spend a lot of time on SSRN and other types of paper kind of publishers. I want to see papers that people are working on in progress. They're the most interesting ones. So for those who are more kind of academically inclined, looking at what's on SSRN new, published that the people are getting some views on are really interesting things to take a look at and learn what ideas will later likely become viral.
Thank you for that. You mentioned, your connection with Wharton's Eric Bradlow for all these years. And we do have a question. What do you see as the value of a mentor or a mentorship?
Yeah, it's literally invaluable. I don't know that I ever had kind of an official mentor, right, or mentee relationship in either direction. And it's also because I'm very socially awkward. I'm autistic. I don't really connect with people in the easiest way. And a lot of fights growing up until I just owned that about myself. So I don't know if I've ever had that type of, very open relationship. But I like listening. I like asking questions. And people who have invested time when I ask questions and ask questions again, and they tend to answer, tend to be the type of people that I would call mentors if maybe they wouldn't call themselves my mentor. But Bradlow is definitely one of them. Adam Grant is definitely one of them. Still to this day, I'm very close with these people. People who helped build Two Sigma, help me think about how I build models till this very day and how I think about risk allocation. Those are some, Alex Stein from Two Sigma is a great example of that, who forced me to read The Man Who Solved the Market, the Jim Simons book, who probably the most insightful thing I learned the last few years about how they build models, where I always have a null hypothesis and I'm trying to either refute it or confirm it, whereas Renaissance's whole business model is if you can explain away the variance, we're not investing because that means someone else can as well, and now we're going to grow to alpha. You have to find the idea that you can't explain, which is completely contradictory to what I would ever think about how I build models. And today that's how I think about it. I don't care why it works, as long as it works, and that's interesting to me. And the pattern is more interesting than the reasoning to the pattern sometimes. So those are some of the people I tend to look up to.
So Joshua wants to know, for someone who is interested in both engineering and business, what would you recommend to study undergrad?
Wharton has a program like that, by the way. Can't remember the name of it, which has engineering and Wharton, blanking on the name right now. That's if you get into
either, but yes, they do. They have a very good one.
If you can get into that program,
We'll pop it in the chat.
There's nothing better that I can think of if you can get into that program. I mean, Penn's one of the best engineering schools in the world, and Wharton is clearly the best business school. Yeah, there we go. So that's the one you would want to go to. I think that it's much harder to go back in life later on and learn engineering. And that's just a reality. You can always get an MBA later. Some would argue you don't even need an MBA ever. You can learn some of those skills in other places. I think it's very valuable still. It was valuable to me, someone who's already built companies at that point. So I think if it was valuable to me, it's probably valuable for a lot of other people as well, despite a lot of people are either at the point of their life where they did really well without an MBA, like to shit on MBAs because they didn't get one, or people who had one and didn't do really well will tell you it's not that worthwhile. It's people that make the best of their lives, I think. I thought it was a really good program for me, but being able to learn engineering at a younger age is a lot easier. So if that's the direction, I would highly, highly recommend focus on the engineering comp sci degree or something like that in the early days. Learn critical thinking around engineering, develop that skill set. You can always pick up the finance later. You can also, if you have enough time and enough wherewithal, you can do that during your undergrad. You can have a dual major in comp sci and finance or econ or something like that, or go to one like the M&T programs where you can just do that, and learn at the same time. So that would be kind of my recommendation.
Okay. And I guess my last question is connected to that one, really. It's an advice question, and we got to end on an advice note, but high school students are always told, find your passion, identify your passion, pursue your passion. And I sometimes get a little annoyed by that because I feel like it's easier said than done, even though, we all know what we like, but necessarily do we want to pursue that as a career? So what advice would you have for high school students who are asked to find their passion and may not know exactly how to do that? And what do you know now that you wish you'd known then that could serve as a guiding light for identifying and pursuing career paths? It sounds like you've sort of been propelled forward by a lot of the decisions you've made, and there's been some inertia there, but I'm wondering exactly what you would advise to your 17-year-old self.
I'm so happy you said that. I think find your passion is horrible advice, because how the fuck am I gonna find my passion? Like, I don't know what that even means, right? What do I do to go find it, right? And so I'm really happy you said that. And it was gonna sound very philosophical, but life is a lot shorter than we think. And I've had to deal with a lot of loss in my life. I had to deal with loss in the army of friends and commanders and soldiers. Ben and I had a few friends when we were kids who died very young. My brother committed suicide just over a month and a half ago. So I've had to deal with a lot of loss in my life broadly. And we don't have that privilege of expecting to live to 100, and make sure that this time matters. Make sure that you're happy. And if you're not happy, whatever the hell you're doing is bad. So make sure that you're happy. And I think that best advice I ever received was do something you'll enjoy failing at, because you're still having fun and still enjoying it. That being said, I'm appreciative of the fact that we all have aspirations to have an easier life. We don't want money because of money. Someone asked, how do I get rich? I don't think it's a stupid question, by the way. I know you might have been a little cynical about the way you were asking. It's not a stupid question. The reason you want to be rich is because you want to be able to do certain things in life that you can't do today, right? Those are all things that are good aspirational things to want. You want to be able to have nicer cars and Maybe you're thinking about your children and how their lives want to be. You want to travel and see the world. You want to have more experiences that other people have that you might not be able to afford right now. I didn't afford all those things when I was a kid, and I can do a lot of those things today. So it's not a bad aspiration to be able to have those experiences, but want the experiences. Don't want the money that comes with those experiences. Want the experiences to figure out how you get there. Try and build tools along the way that make those things a reality, right? So having a good skill set in computer science is probably a guaranteed paycheck down the road. Where do you work as an engineer? I don't know, but probably guaranteed. Getting a liberal arts degree might be fun, a lot harder to find a job afterwards, and you're putting yourself in a challenge. If you're excited about computer science or not, almost doesn't matter. It matters that you're building a tool set that allows you to later follow some of those passions when you decide that you find them or that they find you, or maybe you never found them, you do something fun along the way, you have a skill set that works there. So I would encourage you to think about degrees that give you some tools that will guarantee success, pre-law, econ, stats, finance, engineering, things like that. And I would encourage you to prioritize happiness over everything else. Happiness is not overrated.
Great note to end on. LD Salmanson, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. I really enjoyed our conversation very much. And thanks to all of you for tuning into Wharton Career Chat. Please join us for our next conversation with a Wharton alum. Stay tuned for all the details. Bye, everybody.